Signore e signori, grazie a nome di tutta la nostra comunità per la vostra presenza dall'Accademia Britannica. Accogliervi qui stasera ci dà il più pieno piacere. Well, welcome everyone and thank you all very much for being here with us tonight for the third installment in our series of lectures in which our 9-month award holders present a part of their research undertaken here at the British School at Rome. We are extremely proud of our award holders who, with support from the BSR, go on to make wide-ranging and hugely significant contributions to scholarship and to higher education more generally. This year's Ralegh Radford Rome Fellow, tonight's speaker, Dr. Matthew Hoskin, is no exception. Matthew was recently awarded his PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and with master's degrees in both classics and history of Christianity, Matthew is an exceptionally well-qualified scholar to bridge these two disciplines and to provide a much-needed investigation into the origins of papal letter collections. As you will see tonight, his combination of thorough forensic analysis of the sources as well as sparklingly innovative interpretation is already leading to extremely fruitful outcomes. And while Matthew has clocked up thousands of hours in the Vatican archives, he has also been an outstanding presence here at the British School at Rome, being an extremely positive contributor to workshops, to on-site seminars, and to our broader interdisciplinary dialogue. And we're very grateful to Matthew for adding such value to our activities and helping us to mark the seasons with your changing hat wear. Please join me now in extending a very warm welcome to the British School at Rome's Ralegh Radford Rome Fellow, our manuscripts man and medieval mastermind, Dr. Matthew Hoskin.
Thank you, Tom, and I would like to take this moment to thank the BSR for allowing me to come here and study in the beautiful city of Rome in the lovely Vatican Library for 9 months. And I would like to thank all of you for coming, and I do have a PowerPoint, but the projector, is this the projector? Here we go. Here it comes, it's just warming up. So tonight I'm going to be talking about manuscripts and early Latin canon law, in particular some of our earliest manuscripts. Two of our 3 earliest will come up tonight. I haven't had a chance to look at the 3rd of our 3 earliest in the context of this study. So it's very exciting, and all sorts of grand things are transpiring in the manuscripts of early Latin canon law. And one of the things that's going on in one manuscript that I will be calling M for the rest of the night, it is Vat Reglat 1127 of something called the Collectio Sancti Mauri, and it's on your handout as M. So, and in this manuscript we have the letter of Pope Innocent I to Victricius of Rouen, and it begins with what is obviously, and this is one chapter of it, and this chapter begins with what is obviously a rubric from the original copy that this manuscript was made from that had accidentally been confused with main text because it turns it into a gobbledygook sentence fragment. So that's the very first thing in bold here that you see. But what it is interesting is that it's all about cases being heard by the Pope. Not the Pope of Rome, not the Bishop of Rome, but the Pope. And then moving on from there, this is a discussion of the Bishop of Rome as Court of Appeal. The text says, if in manuscript M, if however such cases or contests arise amongst the clerics, both those of a higher order and those of a lower, with the result that when the bishops of that same province are gathered together, a quarrel is to be finished, it is not allowed to anyone of the Roman Church to which the preserved reverence is owed in all cases. To which the preserved reverence is owed in all cases, as you can see is bolded here, because it too is added in this manuscript. To flee together into other provinces from the rest of the priests who govern the churches of God in that same province by divine pleasure. Now, this manuscript is the only one I have seen yet that accidentally confuses one of the protocols for the main text. However, this edition here, which is the preserved reverence is owed in all cases, is also found in another manuscript, very exciting, of a 6th century collection, just like how M is a 6th century collection, but just like M, a Carolingian manuscript. So is this edition about the Church of Rome being due great reverence, is it a late 6th century edition, or is it an 8th century edition? Or is it somewhere in the middle, in that unknown gap between when these collections were put together and when these manuscripts were made? Another important change is that in the majority tradition, it actually says that you go to the Bishop of Rome according to the Council of Nicaea. So in the early 400s, Innocent I isn't saying, well, if you have problems, you should just ask me. Obviously, I'm the right person to talk to. What he says is, if you have problems, you should go to the Bishop of Rome. He happens to be me. But you should do it on the grounds that the Council of Nicaea says this is the way to do things. And everyone agreed that the Council of Nicaea was a source of universal authority in the church at this time. So at some point between Innocent in the 400s and either the compilation of this in M or in TE, here's just a little picture of it because it's digitized. The Bishop of Rome has gone from a person whose authority resides in tradition, whose authority resides in this interconnected world of the Council of Nicaea, to someone who can simply say he is the Papa, not a Papa. He is what he is becoming. He is becoming someone who doesn't need to reference the Council of Nicaea for his own authority. It is an accepted authority in the Western Church. And so the question is, when do these sorts of changes start happening in the role of the Bishop of Rome, who is already held in highest esteem in the West? Is it starting to happen now already in the 500s, or is it happening later in the Carolingian age when the manuscripts are written? The entire story is one that I have yet to completely disentangle, but the manuscripts help us. And this is the sort of thing that I'm hoping to talk to you about tonight, but not in quite as much detail as that, because when you're not looking in that sort of argument in print, it's actually really hard to follow. So cheers to any of you who made it through this complicated introduction. So, the papal letters, whose textual criticism I've been analyzing over the last 8.5 months, were all written in the period from 385 to 432 by 4 of the popes who were incumbents of the See of Rome at the time. Before going any further, I should flag up that I'm going to use the word pope and all the adjectives associated with it as shorthand for Bishop of Rome, without assuming the constructions of authority and primacy that later attach themselves to the person of the Bishop of Rome and the word pope, since that's the thing I'm precisely trying to sort out. But it's a lot easier to say pope or papal as opposed to Episcopal of Rome, Roman Episcopal, or Bishop of Rome all the time. And these popes are Pope SIRICIUS, Pope Innocent I, Pope Zosimus, and Pope Celestine I. And you can see one of my favorite churches in Rome is Santa Sabina on the Aventine, and it dates from the papacy of Celestine I. These letters that I'm going to look at, the letters of these popes, are transmitted to us in collections of documents called canonical collections. And I've got just a little definition for you. A canonical collection is a collection of documents that are pertinent to canon law. They consist of canons from church councils, so those are disciplinary rulings, papal letters, sometimes imperial or royal laws relating to religion, and other documents that the compilers found helpful, sometimes including such things even as lists of Roman provinces and major civitates, the purpose of which was to help bishops figure out where they stood in the pecking order. And to further back to our question of what is going on, so I'm not confused by someone who does the later medieval world or the Renaissance or something, This is the later Roman Empire. So SIRICIUS was pope for the end of Theodosius I's reign and the beginning of the reign of Honorius. Innocent and Zosimus were popes during Honorius' reign, and Celestine was pope during the end of Honorius' reign and the beginning of that of Valentinian III. The major ecclesiastical controversies were Priscillianism under Siricius, Pelagianism under Innocent, and Nestorianism under Celestine. While these popes actually did write on those subjects, these proto-collections and these letters that I'm looking at are about canon law, they're about discipline, about church procedure, they're about orthopraxy, the right doing, rather than orthodoxy, right belief. These decades are the last decades also of what many people think of as the golden age of patristics. And just so I can turn this into holiday snaps, Santa Maria Antiqua for all of you, Christ flanked by the fathers of the church. And this is the period after the First Council of Constantinople, which took place in 381, had settled the question of Arianism for the imperial church. And we see this fact visible in the letter of Siricius because he discusses the process for reconciling Arians, or Homoians as we might call them today, to the imperial Catholic Church. At this time, many great Latin, Greek, and Syriac theologians of the ancient church were active. Now, the textual criticism of early papal letters, as it turns out, is a very complicated business. In the first place, which is common for most ancient documents, we have no autograph of any papal correspondence before this guy, Hadrian I. He was I like to call him one of Charlemagne's popes. And the Hadrian Papyrus, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, who have not digitized it yet, even though they're digitizing at the faster rate than anyone I know, it's a fragment. But, of course, the fact that papal letters were written on papyrus is part of our problem, that papyrus is very fragile, and think of the humid places that they're going to be headed to in Western Europe. They don't really stand much of a chance. Our first complete register of papal correspondence is that of Gregory VII, from whom I found this great quote. And this is, so his register, which is a complete single-bound volume of all of the letters stored in the archive, is our oldest surviving one. And of course, lacking an original, lacking an autograph of a text is not a big deal. This is the case with almost all pre-modern writings. However, papal letters are complicated, not simply because they do not survive in the autographs, but because they survive in collections of documents of diverse origin. They're not like the correspondence of Cicero, Pliny, Cyprian, or Sidonius. The manuscripts in which they survive are all collections of documents put together usually decades or centuries after the original letter was sent. Almost none of these collections are derived immediately from the papal archive or from those popes who wrote the letters. Different people in different places at different times took these papal letters that interested them the most or were most helpful to the questions that were facing them at the time. Some people seem to have taken every single letter they could get their hands on by some popes. And they gathered them together into these canonical collections. As a result of this gathering together later on, there are traces of pre-existing collections within the bigger collections. I call these pre-existing collections the proto-collections. Proto-collections are smaller collections that are, as I say, they're lost as independent witnesses, but they were incorporated sometimes wholesale into larger surviving collections. At any given moment, a collection or proto-collection will contain a text of a papal letter that may descend from the archival copy, from the sent copy, or from some other circular copy. Sometimes a bishop of Rome might send out the copy to the person who was originally intended for, and then later on he might think, you know what, that was a really good letter. We're going to send it out to a bunch of other people now as well. Most famously, Leo the Great sent one of his letters to pretty much everyone at least twice, it seems. And as far as letters generally go, from the moment a letter was received in late antiquity, there was a chance that companions of the recipient had made copies, as we learn from this great quote from Gregory of Nyssa writing to Libanius in the late 4th century. For it so happened that on that day, as I was visiting the metropolis of the Cappadocians, I met one of my acquaintances who handed me this gift, your letter, as a feast day present. I was overjoyed at this good fortune, threw open my gain to all who were present. All shared in it, each eagerly acquiring the whole of it, while I was none the worse off. For the letter, as it passed through the hands of all, became the private wealth of each. Some by memorizing the words through repeated reading, others by taking a copy of them upon tablets. Amongst the papal letters, many of them, such as the letter of SIRICIUS I'll be discussing today, were actually recommended for circulation, at least to the immediate region, as SIRICIUS says, "Now we urge the soul of your fraternity to preserve the canons and hold the established decretals more and more, so you may make the knowledge of those responses which we have written to your consultations to be carried to all of our fellow bishops, not only those in your diocese, but also all of those in Carthaginiensis and Baetica, Lusitania and Gallicia." So that's all the places in Spain. Oh, see, the happy face, sorry. The happy face is approximately Tarragona, which is where the letter was originally sent. And those who border in the neighboring provinces. So send it to everyone in Spain and also pass it on to people in Gaul. And some letters, such as the letter of Celestine to all of the bishops of Apulia and Calabria, have multiple recipients. So from the moment a papal letter gets sent, there are probably multiple copies already. And so the idea of being able to trace ourselves back to what the Pope originally or really said could be impossible. Tonight, I'm going to look at two proto-collections termed the Canones Urbicani and the Epistulae Decretales. The Canones Urbicani are a selection of decretals that begin with the rubric Incipiunt Canones Urbicani. You probably cannot read it, but I promise you that's what that says right there. The letters that follow this rubric are Innocent I to Exuperius of Toulouse, Innocent to the bishops of Macedonia, Zosimus to Hesychius of Salona, Celestine to the bishops of Viennensis and Narbonensis, Celestine to the bishops of Apulia and Calabria, and it exists in Collectio Coloniensis, which is K on your handout, Collectio Romensis, which is Ray on your handout, Collectio Albigensis, which is Al on your handout, because elsewhere in my research I also have another one that starts with A, and Collectio Laurusamensis, which is L on your handout. I need to turn the page. L is the only one of these that exists in more than one manuscript, and Coloniensis and Albigensis are the only ones that exist in manuscripts contemporaneous with their collecting. Of L, I have only consulted the one manuscript, the Vat Pal Lat 574, since the other manuscript of it is in Gotha and I just haven't had the time to get up there. In this collection, in all of them, except for Romensis, the next thing that comes is the letter of SIRICIUS, so the letter from the fourth of the popes I'm discussing tonight. And then in K, right after SIRICIUS, we get the letter of Innocent I to Victricius. This is preceded by the rubric of the Epistulae Decretales. It seems that the compiler of K had both of these two proto-collections, and he used the Epistulae Decretales to complete his set of popes. So, the Epistulae Decretales has this rubric here. Incipiunt Epistulae Decretales, Universorum Episcoporum Urbis Romae, pro diversorum provinciarum, diversus provincias missa. I probably actually filled it out there, yeah. So, and that's in manuscript K. The collection as a whole, or what we assume is the collection as a whole, exists in manuscript F here. And it is a bit better because it's diversorum instead of universorum. So this has the following letters: Innocent of Victricius, Exuperius, bishops of Macedonia and Dacia, Zosimus to Hesychius. Then the Acts of the Council of Carthage 419, which you may guess is not an Epistula Decretalis. Then Celestine to the bishops of Viennensis and Narbonensis, and then Celestine to the bishops of Apulia and Calabria. If you're not confused, if you're not confused, well done. If you are confused, there's just a little thing for you to look at to sort out the difference between these two collections. The Epistulae Decretalis is a larger collection. F is important because it is our only fully intact version of the Epistulae Decretales. So this exists only intact in F. K, because K is a manuscript of this, the only thing from the Epistulae Decretales it has is the rubric and then the first letter, because these other ones are already elsewhere in the collection. F's manuscript is from the late 700s. And F overall looks like it was composed out of two parts. There's an earlier part that includes the Epistolae Decretales plus a number of other material that looks like it was put around together in the time of a certain African presbyter named Appiarius of Sicca, who Henry Chadwick in his book on the early church called a very tiresome person. And the other one was put together in the 490s at the time, what was called the Acacian Schism. Now, Appiarius got defrocked because of immoral behavior and various canonical abuses. He ran off to Rome and appealed to Pope Boniface I, who was the predecessor of Pope Celestine. And Boniface, without asking the Africans if for evidence or anything, just said, "Oh, sure, Appiarius, you seem like a nice guy. We'll let you back in." And so then the Africans thought they were not well pleased. So they called together a little council, a local council in Carthage, to deal with the fact that this person that they had excommunicated had been reinstated by the Bishop of Rome without asking even information from them about the affair. And it came out in the midst of this that part of what the Bishop of Rome was basing his judgments upon was a canon that all of the Romans said, well, this is from the Council of Nicaea. And the Africans said, we've never seen this canon before. And the Romans said, well, that's a problem. What we'll do is we'll write to the East and get new copies of the original Greek. And so they wrote off to Constantinople and Alexandria. They got new copies of the Greek, translated them into Latin, and discovered that in fact it was from the Council of Sardica, not Nicaea, and the Africans had never accepted the Council of Sardica into their canon law. So it was kind of a blow for the Romans that they kind of had confused Sardica for Nicaea. It's a difference of like 19 years, and whether something's ecumenical or not, whether you could even use it in international canon law. So that's a bit of a blow for them. So what happens in the wake of that is Roman Christians are like, we got to get ourselves canon law collections. And so what we think happened was they put together this collection of all the Greek stuff that was newly translated with a special letter from Cyril of Alexandria himself, and a bunch of papal decretals, as well as the Acts of Carthage 419, which is this extra thing here in the midst of the Epistolae Decretales. So they put all of this together. And when you think about this context, I have to say it's a bit disappointing to me, because this means it happened sometime between 424 and 432 in the final years of Celestine's episcopate, because that's when they finally sorted out the Appiarius thing, and not, as I had dreamed and hypothesized before I started this project, the papacy of Leo the Great. This is my most used slide, Leo the Great having been the subject of my PhD dissertation, but sadly, no, it's from Celestine I. So they put F together in 395 with this one selection at the beginning of stuff that has to do with Appiarius of Sicca, then a bunch of other stuff that has to do with a bunch of stuff later on that is just as confusing, that we won't talk about right now. But it seems that it is a thing wedded together. So we have at least two layers of collections being put together in F, and then the Epistolae Decretales is almost a third layer beneath that. These contents, because of the Appiarius affair, because of the major things that were going on in the late 400s when it was put together, the contents put the original of F in Italy, but the manuscript itself is, I forget, well, it was found in Freising, which is why its name is Frisingensis, but it comes from somewhere else in Germany that I forget, which means that we can see canon law manuscripts don't just sit around where you compile them. People want to get their hands on stuff, so these things are moving around and this means later on things can also get really mixed up in terms of whether you think something could be from Italy or from Gaul or wherever else. And before I leave the subject of F, one further thing is worth saying, just right there. It uses the word papa all the time. It does not say episcopus orbis Romae. It doesn't say bishop of the city of Rome, which is the normal way that 5th century popes refer to themselves. As you can see here, Innocentius Papa Decentio Episcopo Egubino. And so we see that maybe by 495, probably more likely by the 700s, we have scribes writing Papa to simply refer to the Bishop of Rome. In the 400s, on the other hand, this word is used of all bishops indiscriminately. It is a word that simply refers to the spiritual fatherhood of the role of bishop. Bishops use it of each other. I recommend reading the letters of Sidonius Apollinaris. In fact, I just recommend reading the letters of Sidonius whether you're interested in the use of the word papa or not. And this way, it is used in this way right into the 500s, as the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae attests. All of it has no examples of papa being used exclusively of the Bishop of Rome. So this means that we have this corruption of the text right here that slipped into F, probably not in 495, but probably at some point maybe the copyist of the 700s. That we have all of a sudden, we have the Bishop of Rome as the Pope. He is the successor of St. Peter, and he's more than a final court of arbitration when things go wrong, but he is in fact the Christ's vicar on earth and the supreme head, and all of these very medieval ideas that I don't think were quite there in Innocent's mind. And I believe, however, that the story that I'm slowly getting around to telling you is an important part of the story of getting from the Bishop of Rome being a papi to papa to being the papa, because it is putting these letters, these papal letters, together with canons of ecumenical councils in the same book in the 400s, and then sending it around. People are copying them in Italy, in Gaul, in Spain, maybe Africa, that putting these things together reinforces the authority of the Bishop of Rome on a universal scale, just like the authority of an ecumenical council would be received on a universal scale. The letters that I'm here to talk about tonight are current in all of our early collections, most of which are listed, not most of which, a great many of which are listed on your handout. Maybe most, but part of me fears there are even more that I forgot. Those are the ones that come up, though. And when I was looking at these, I wanted to know what we could see about the different origins of the collections, because several questions are unanswerable without looking at the vast majority of what is in a text. Hitherto, people have looked at the order of the contents, and they have looked at the paratextual elements like the rubrics that we've been discussing, or is he Innocentius Papa or is he Innocentius Episcopus Orbis Romae? I have decided that what about the other things? What sorts of things can we learn from these manuscripts if we look at all of the readings for this set of letters? Can we find more relationships? Because when we do this, then we could start to see, were the Epistulae Decretales or the Canones Urbicani actually used by some of these other collections? Were they a source for these other ones who didn't hold on to the paratextual elements? Because an editor need not slavishly copy everything he sees. Indeed, we know that they don't. And then, are the texts of these letters in Gallic versions significantly different from those in Italian ones? And what relationship does this selection of 5th century popes have with the letter of Pope Siricius to Himerius of Tarragona? And so, let's move on to Siricius. This letter is usually cited as having been uniformly transmitted independently of its fellows before the big whopping collections that are listed on your handout. It is one of our very first decretals, and this is a genre of letter wherein the Pope gives his judgment, his opinion, his ideas, not ideas, it's firmer than ideas, on a question of procedure, canon law, even the liturgy maybe. And it isn't really popular between 385 and Innocent, again, about 15, 20 years later. And as with Innocent, the quantity of papal letters that are legislative in this way really starts to grow. And it is in a whole bunch of collections. I think it's in everything on your handout, in fact, plus one more that I forgot to get into the handout, right there. That one's not on your handout, just to keep you on your toes. The first thing I looked at were chapter divisions, which proved to be a dead end. So we'll just skip over that part, except there are some manuscripts that don't make any chapter divisions. They have no chapter headings, no chapter divisions at all. In and of itself, I don't think that's that big a deal, because I don't believe that these letters were originally written with chapter divisions, given how wildly they can shift and change between different collections. However, it was worth noting that the collections that give no chapter divisions and no chapter headings are the Collectio Coloniensis, the Collectio Laurasimensis, K, L, and the Collectio Sancti Mauri. And in fact, in its jumbled transmission of the letter, the collection called Al on your handout, which is our other one of the Canones Urbicani, it only gives us 2 chapters with chapter headings, and those are the only 2 chapters marked out in the text. The rest of it is just a big block of text full of holes, out of order, and just a bit of a mess, really. So I haven't looked at the 4th of the Canones Urbicani manuscripts yet, I'm sorry, so anything else that I say about this is tentative, but I think I'm right, so it's not that big a deal, right? So, but what I think is more important than the fact that they don't give chapter headings is the fact that they do these are the only manuscripts that start the letter in this way, which is Incipit Epistola Decretales Sancti Sirecii Episcopi Urbis Romae. They are the only manuscripts that start the letter in that way, with that exact wording. And they also all put the letter in the same position in relation to the Canones Urbicani, which is after it. Now, K, L, and Al, as it turns out, are in strong agreement in their variants in this letter in other places. I will not give you all the examples because you would therefore die from boredom as I just sat there and pointed out Latin phrase versus Latin phrase, Latin phrase versus Latin phrase. So here are just a few. So you can see distinctione versus districtione. They have this omission here, which everyone else includes this phrase, concubitu versus coitu, and then they give lengths of time when they're discussing the ranks that the clergy have to move through on the way from acolyte to bishop. They actually give lengths of time for all of them, which other manuscripts do not do. This giving lengths of time for the clergy in the different ranks is inevitably something that has been added later on, because it's precisely the sort of thing that when you're using a book, you're likely to say, oh yeah, and here's this other piece of information you forgot. So my theory is that they're added in, because it's not present in other early sources. And then Al and L are both lacunos, and the portions that they miss are not entirely identical, but very frequently, although they don't start a gap at the same place, they restart the text at the same place. So that means that something's going on. I don't quite know how to explain or describe it yet, but I think it's significant how frequently the holes in the text are similar, if not identical, in those 2 manuscripts, especially when no one else has holes quite as badly as they do. So, what I therefore would like to argue, based upon a whole bunch of evidence that I'm not presenting, is that their text of the letter of Siricius to Himerius of Tarragona is in fact part of the Canones Urbicani, and that it comes after the other letters, and that the compilers of these collections K, L, Al, and hopefully Ray, when I get around to doing that manuscript, when the Canones Urbicani came to them, it came to them in the form with the letter of Siricius as part of it. The main arguments against its being in the Canones Urbicani are the fact that it has a different location in the 4th manuscript, Ray, and the fact that it has its own inscription, whereas the other letters that are included in the Canones Urbicani do not, which is why people have cut this proto-collection off just before Siricius. However, it is to be noted, as far as Ray is concerned, it has a whole bunch of extra things thrown in, as you can see here, if you compare it to the standard order. And it has put those things in chronological order. Since the letter of Siricius comes before, in chronology, it comes before the other letters of the Canones Urbicani, it would make sense that this editor would move it from its position at the end up to a new position somewhere up here. The fact that it has its own inscription is a bit harder to argue against, but I think that because it is such a significant letter, it is one of our earliest places where the Bishop of Rome argues for himself as being, as carrying within him the authority of St. Peter, then I think that it was a letter that people knew, and so it was important to flag it up, even in the Canones Urbicani, because it is a famous letter. It is a letter that is everywhere. That is my argument for that at present. And very quickly, in the letter to SIRICIUS, when we look at the Epistolae Decretales, we find that manuscript F and manuscript W are very frequently in agreement. I have 2 times that they agree listed for you out of many, many more. These ones are just important because they're both additions, and so additions, I think, are an important kind of variant that is much stronger than things that could be a common error. So this is important because people keep saying that W is a descendant of Q, but Q doesn't have either of these additions. And I think that people are just obsessed with Q and don't spend enough time looking at other collections, and so I think people need to start looking at a whole lot more evidence than just the Collectio Quesneliana. As great as the Collectio Quesneliana is, I don't want to speak ill of it in case it's listening, but I think that we need to look more broadly at the textual criticism just as deeply at all of these other collections that exist in fewer manuscripts that maybe had less of an impact later on, but that are of the same time period as it, to be able to see these other relationships where we have this manuscript descended of something from Italy that we know makes its way to what is now Germany by the Carolingian age, shares a lot of similarities with this manuscript that is a Carolingian manuscript from what is now Germany. I think that's a really important thing to note. And I think if we keep focusing on Quesneliana, we'll keep missing these sorts of questions. Moving on from F and W, it is just worth noting that manuscripts, the collection of manuscripts called D on your handout and the collection of manuscripts called Q, these are ones that have loads of manuscripts. By loads, I mean like Q has 5. So that's pretty a lot for these sorts of things. We're not talking St. Augustine here. Q and D are at odds with both each other and the rest of the manuscript tradition in a whole variety of ways. And this is the case not just in the letter of SIRICIUS, but throughout all of the letters that have collated. And the fact that D in particular stands out overall bolsters the belief that various scholars have put forward every once in a while that Dionysius Exiguus had access to the papal archive when he put it together, because if no one else is, then you expect a guy who does have access to the archive to be different from the people who don't. So that's my argument there. In sum, my investigations into the letter of SIRICIUS, I argue that it was part of the original Canones Urbicani, that the text of W seems to come from the same branch of tradition as F, not of Q. Q and D are divergent from both each other and from pretty much everyone else. This leaves, of the things I've been looking at here in Rome, T and V undiscussed. They demonstrate a broad family similarity with F and M, and since they are definitively Italian in origin, this helps us place M for the decretals within the Italian textual tradition, even though we know that the collection was put together in Gaul after 550. So at some point, once again, we have Italian texts making their way into Gaul before 550. Some people say M is descended from Q, but I think that's just as problematic as saying W is. And then K, Al, and L, once again, represent Gaul. And then T, V, F, and M are Italy. Q and D, also Italian, but they seem to be from us, they're disunited from the other Italians, who do unite very frequently. Not frequently enough to say that they are all siblings, but they seem to be cousins, maybe sometimes up to 3 times removed, but they're more closely related to each other than they are to the Gallic manuscripts, if that makes sense. Looking at, moving on then from the letter of SIRICIUS, which has hitherto not always been considered so broadly, nor with the Canones Urbicani and Epistolae Decretales in this way, I would like to talk about the letter of Innocent to Exuperius, because it occurs in both the Canones Urbicani and the Epistolae Decretales. Once again, we see that D and Q are doing the same sorts of things that they were doing before, so that's not worth talking about. But we do find that this time W, for whatever reason, has decided that it would like to agree with Q. I mean, not with Q, with M. Still rarely with Q, but it agrees with M a lot this time. And it also starts converging with the Gallic manuscripts rather than with F. And so in some, we have once again D and Q versus all. We have the Gallic trio united, but then we find that F, W, and M are more problematically related between the three than I had thought when I looked at the letter of SIRICIUS. This means that I need to spend time with the M manuscript I have yet to see and all of the Q manuscripts to be able to figure out what is going on here. Italy versus Gaul once more, though. So the most significant variant in this letter, however, comes in the last chapter. In this chapter, Innocent has given Exuperius a canon of Scripture. I think this is really important, and I have looked at books about the development of the canon of Scripture, and let me tell you, this letter isn't cited, and I think that is. I think it's really surprising that you would talk about the Council of Carthage in 397, which is a local council, but then not talk about something being done by the Bishop of Rome, of all people, a decade later. But I think there are all sorts of reasons why people who do biblical studies don't look at things done by popes. So Innocent gives Exuperius a canon of Scripture, beginning now then those books that are to be received into the canon. A brief supplement demonstrates. The list of the books of the Bible that he gives is what we would expect from the ancient church. It does in fact agree with the contents of the Council of Carthage from 397. And it also agrees with the Greek canon, first spelled out by Athanasius of Alexandria in the 350s. This is to say, it gives us the Old Testament, including those books called the Apocrypha. So that is Tobias, Judith, 1 and 2 Maccabees, 2nd Esdras, and 5 books of Solomon. So, besides the 3 books of Solomon in your Protestant Bible, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, you also get Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach/Ecclesiasticus, depending how you want to name that last one. At the end of the letter, Innocent warns of some non-canonical books to be wary of. And he says that the rest of the things, whether they're under the name of Matthias, or of James the Less, or under the name of Peter or John, which were written by a certain Lucius, or under the name of Andrew, which were written by Xenocarides and Leonidas the philosophers, and whatever other such like things. In that, this phrase here, under the name of Andrew, which by Xenocarides and Leonidas, the philosophers, is missing from Q, M, V, and T. Manuscript L misses the entire chapter, so it does the fact that this isn't there, the whole thing's missing. And so I think it's important that I'm obsessed with the W's relationship to other manuscripts. I'm not quite sure why, but I can't get it off my mind. But people say it's descended from Q, but it includes something that our Q manuscripts lack. So that once again signals to me that this is an important fact. It also reminds us that as much as you might like something like the Collectio Vaticana, which is V, or the Collectio Quesneliana, which is Q, or even the Collectio Theatina, which I personally do like, through homoio archeon, which is the beginnings of things being insane, sub nomine, stuff falls out of manuscripts. So with this particular division, we have QMVT against DWK, Al, and F. With the QD division already well known in the decretals, as is the union of K and Al. Since F is another of our earliest attestations for this letter along with K and Al, it is quite heartening to see it united with K and Al in giving this reading. What is surprising, I suppose, is that W is at war with M on this point, as well as Q. And so, once again, need to look at more of the manuscripts of M and Q to be able to sort out what's going on with those three. So, where does this leave us, except for possibly confused? Let me tell you. We have some Italians. We have Q, D, V, T. F seems to, because it agrees with our Gallic guys a few times, has some possibly Gallic features. And then we have the people from, so this is Italy. You know Italy. Gaul is this thing there. It's like France, but it's not. Whenever people say to you, Gaul is France, they're lying to you. It's almost France, but bigger. And then we have W and M, which are manuscripts. They're collections that originate in Gaul, but M has very strong features with the Italian textual tradition. This is important to know. It's important to have observed this about M because it comes from just after 550, which means that by the 550s, we have these Italian collections. They're crossing the Alps, they're going to Gaul, and people are copying them. And so whoever put together M, he's got all of his Gallic council. He's like, yeah, local councils, good times. Hey, let's get some popes. And the collection of the pope letters that he grabs, it's not the collection found in the other Gallic manuscripts, it's an Italian collection. The text, if we want to think in terms of text types, if that's not too, I don't know, 1950s for you, that is what is going on here. But what does all this mean? F, W, and M converge and diverge all the time. Some people have argued W and M are descendants of Q. But I think that if we consider M's relationship with F as well, F is contemporaneous with Q. And it strikes me that a few decades later, the source that both F and Q had available to them could easily have been available to the person who put together M, and M need not have relied on either F or Q. That's what I argue for why M looks sometimes like F and sometimes like Q, is because he's using a source that possibly was common to them, which would explain why he would have an omission from one and an addition from another. Because it's only a couple decades later. It's not as though as soon as you put something in a canonical collection, you go and burn it or something. So, yes, M is from Gaul. Talked about that thoroughly. Sorry. I went off my notes for a moment there, and so now I'm lost. My sincerest apologies. This is going to be great on the podcast later, isn't it? So, what is the overall significance of having collated so many manuscripts and seen the relationships? I would like to say that, first of all, I have in a very thorough way confirmed the main arguments of Hubert Würm from the 1930s, which I think is a thing worth doing, because if no one else has revisited it since then, he could have been wrong. That is to say, the Canones Urbicani and the Epistulae Decretales are in fact two distinct sources, and they do not, as it turns out, seem to have been used in the creation of other 6th century canonical collections. This fact could not be ascertained without lots of painstaking look at the manuscripts, giving the sorts of arguments I was talking about tonight. Simply to say, oh look, they're in a different order, or they have different paratextual things like the rubrics and the inscriptions and the subscriptions and things, is not enough, because an editor, as I said earlier, could change the rubrics. We know that Dionysius Exiguus, one of the few compilers of these who we actually know anything about, consciously wrote his own chapter headings for all of the letters in his collection. He added chapter headings for some of the Greek canons that had none, like the Synod of Gangra. And so we know that editors can get up to these sorts of things. And so simply having, as Würm's book helpfully does, lists of all of the letters in these collections with what their chapter headings are listed in the back of a book is not enough to actually see whether or not everything is related. But it turns out he was right anyway. But we can be confident now and say that these are two distinct sources that no one else seems to have used independent of these manuscripts. That we seem, unless we find, let's say until we find a new manuscript, this is what we can say. I have further been able to group together the collections between Italy and Gaul on the one hand, which confirms Würm again, saying that Canones Urbicani is Gallic, Epistulae Decretales is Italian, but then also Q versus D versus the rest of the world on the other. This bolsters my argument against Würm for Dionysius having used the papal archive, but it also highlights the uniqueness of Q. What are Q's origins? Furthermore, the apparently diverse origin of the text of these decretals in the rest of the Italian ones, D, Q, V, T, possibly M, shows us how widespread these decretals were in their early and divisible stage of transmission. It's sort of like we're getting a glimpse at Libanius' letter arriving with Gregory of Nyssa. All your friends get a copy. People are memorizing it. People are writing it down on wax tablets before to copy out again later on. That is why papal letters, which don't have a control at this stage, there's no control copy anywhere, Well, there is, but no one's looking at it except for possibly Dionysius Exiguus. Means that the dispersal of these is so varied. We can find similarities throughout Italian versions, but they're still fairly diverse. The three Gallic manuscripts are the three most closely related ones out of all of this, not just in contents, but even in the wording, even in the letter of Siricius. And seeing that people were copying these in Italy, then taking these to Gaul, and they were binding together letters from the Bishop of Rome alongside local concerns. This, I think, is a really important thing. This isn't like in some of our Gallic manuscripts, we find letters of Caesarius of Arles. That makes sense. He's from Gaul. But we are also getting letters from bishops of Rome to people in places that are not Gaul, people in Italy, people in Africa, people in Spain, people in Constantinople. The reception of the popes into Gallic canon law is an important step in the movement of the Bishop of Rome from being the metropolitan of suburban Italy, or indeed the metropolitan of all of Italy, moved from being simply the court of appeal when things go wrong at a local church council to being the Pope, basically. And reception is what forges universality in canon law. It was lack of universal recognition that prevented the Council of Sardica, which took place in 344, from being considered an ecumenical council, even though it had a very large number of bishops present, whereas the Council of Nicaea, which had a similar number of bishops present 19 years earlier, people received it. They were like, yep, that one's ecumenical. We sign off on that. And indeed, we can see reception in another church council, the Second Ecumenical Council of 381. People are not straight away saying, yep, that was an ecumenical council. People by the year 451 are saying that, but there's this 70-year period where people are saying, oh yeah, there was this council that happened once in Constantinople, but they're not necessarily saying, and that one, it's totally awesome for everybody. They're saying, yeah, this council happened and they did stuff. They're not yet fully considered universal in jurisdiction, but they are eventually received as such, and that is what makes them into true sources of authority in canon law. And so the same goes for papal letters as for ecumenical councils. And so it really matters that in the 400s, people were gathering and circulating letters written by the Bishop of Rome. It means that we already are getting movement towards the Pope, movement towards the Papa. It's not there yet, and it's still what you might think of as the Pope today is not even what the Pope was 500 years ago. It's not what the Pope was in the 1200s. It's not what the Pope was in the 400s or 500s, 600s, as I'm looking at here. But we're seeing the movement towards the reception of the Bishop of Rome as an authority in matters of church legislation in Italy and southern Gaul in the 400s. And as I have said, Italian collections are making their way into Gaul before 550. In the case of Q, all of whose manuscripts come from Gaul, but we've determined that it is an Italian collection, and whatever M's source was. The one major difference between me and Hubert Worm is that I include Siricius to HIMERIUS in the Canones Urbicani. This once again, I think, helps us rethink conceptions of papal power in the 5th century. This is the first Epistula Decretalis ever written by the Bishop of Rome. This is the first time the Bishop of Rome has answered a letter written to him by another bishop. And he has sat down, well, it's not the first time he's written a letter, but it's the first time he's done it in the following way. First time he has sat down to answer a letter, and he has written it like it was an imperial rescript. The style, the arrangement of the contents. This is a rescript from the Pope to a bishop in Spain. No bishop of Rome had done this before. Simply by writing his letter in this style, Siricius is making large claims for the authority of the Bishop of Rome beyond simply the guy you ask when there's no one left to ask, which is really what the Bishop of Rome as final court of appeal means. And he is also the first time that the Bishop of Rome says that the blessed Apostle Peter carries these duties in us. He also talks about how it is the duty of the Bishop of Rome to uphold and exercise the authority and inheritance of the apostles. He protects the apostolic inheritance. That's actually what he says, the part about him protecting it. And this letter is included in the Canones Urbicanae in Gaul, probably before the year 400. Putting it after the other decretals, which are less explicit about the Bishop of Rome, and sometimes, due to the fragmentary nature, are less clearly like an imperial rescript. Taking this letter that is so clearly papal, the way we might think of the Pope being the Pope, and putting it there with them, reframes the way you read everything that you've just read. You read that, and then what's the next thing in my book? Oh, the next thing in my book is, oh, SIRICIUS to HIMERIUS. Oh, the authority of St. Peter resides in the Bishop of Rome. These are all of a sudden not simply decisions. These are not simply decreta anymore. They are turning into decretals. These are turning into letters written by the Bishop of Rome that have a universal binding jurisdiction in canon law. Siricius' careful assertion of Roman primacy increases the prestige of the letters of his successors, while they're circulating together as this little collection in southern Gaul. And I think the journey of these proto-collections to Gaul is very important, because northern Gaul in the 5th century, well, in the 420s, northern Gaul was slipping away from Roman Imperium. Southern Gaul was slipping away in the 440s, and then there simply was no Roman Imperium in Gaul as of 476. People continued using titles, and every once in a while someone might be consul, even, from Gaul, but it's not. The real power had transferred from Romans to people who the local population thought of as barbarians. And so the local Roman population was looking for a locus of authority in a turbulent world. And this still existed ecclesiastically if it did not exist in the secular world. So while there would still be a few local councils in Gaul in the 400s, fairly few in the 400s, more in the 500s, people had to find somewhere to find authentic ecclesiastical tradition. And so they found it in these canonical collections, where they had ecumenical councils and letters from the Bishop of Rome. And so here they found in the letters of the Bishop of Rome, in these decretals, a source of unity and a locus of power, that they found not just a papa in Rome, but that particular papa resident in Rome, perhaps someone who could be the papa of us all. And so these letters, some of them are the longest and most significant papal decretals written in the period from 385 to 432. These were copied, and they were recopied, and they were incorporated into collections of local documents. And so then letters sent by the Bishop of Rome to bishops in the green places here, Tarragona, Toulouse, Rouen, Salona, Macedonia, Apulia, Calabria, Viennensis, Narbonensis, took on a universal applicability, and this is a short step from universal authority. This then is the start of the decretal tradition. It is not simply Siricius sitting down and writing a letter. The Bishop of Rome could sit down and write all the letters he wants that say, the authority of St. Peter resides in me. The duty of the Church of Rome is to protect the apostolic inheritance. The Bishop of Rome could sit down and write things about calling himself the Apostolic See as much as he wants, but until people receive that authority, it is meaningless. It is simply the Bishop of Rome in what looks to us as an exercise of power. But what he is doing is, because these are received in the succeeding decades, these are received by people not just in Italy, where he is the metropolitan bishop, where he does actually hold power recognized by everyone, but even in Gaul, he's being received into their canon law collections as a sign that he has universal jurisdiction in canon law. So it is clear from the early date of these collections that before 550, people beyond Rome were starting to see the Roman bishop as the papa, not just a papa. And as I said, it is reception that forges tradition, and it is upon tradition that canon law has always rested. It is the Bible, it is the Fathers, it is the Council of Nicaea, and then it is the Pope. So to return to that corrupted quotation from the beginning, Innocent in the 400s asserts the validity of his rulings by reference to the Council of Nicaea, by the late 500s or possibly the Carolingian era, depending on the origins of the omission, the reference to Nicaea has become completely unnecessary. The Pope himself has become the bearer of tradition and the locus of authority. Thank you very much.